April 8th was the deadliest day of this escalation. While the world was still cautiously talking about a peace of arms between the USA and Iran, Israel bombed southern Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley, and densely populated neighborhoods in the center of Beirut, 4 times and without any warning. Hospitals were completely overloaded, over 2,000 dead, more than 1 million displaced. These are destroyed lives, destroyed families, destroyed perspectives. The Islamist terrorist organization Hezbollah bears considerable responsibility, and this is exactly where the failure of the international community lies. It is a weakness that it has not succeeded in stabilizing Lebanon so far, that non-state armed actors lose influence. On the contrary, any further military escalation strengthens Hezbollah because it exploits insecurity and gains approval from it. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, whoever wants to weaken it does not achieve this through bombs, but through stabilization and social security. But, and this is just as clear, national law is not selective. This is why we must also mention the role of Israel. The bombing of densely populated residential areas without warning, the ground offensive and the planned buffer zone in southern Lebanon represent a significant escalation and are not compatible with humanitarian national law. Such a zone would in fact mean an annexation under military control. Extortion and the destruction of livelihoods do not create security. They create new injustice and another escalating violence. But this ceasefire is stable. The attacks continue. Central issues remain unsolved. And this also shows clearly that without political solutions, every ceasefire remains fragile. This conflict will not be resolved militarily, and still dominates a logic of escalation. And Germany is also responsible for this. Those who allow further arms exports to this region and provide military infrastructure contribute to the dynamics of this conflict. What we need now is a stable ceasefire. We need serious diplomatic initiatives, and we must finally strengthen the forces that are overlooked too often. The civil society in Lebanon, the social and feminist movements in Lebanon. Lebanon was known decades ago as the Switzerland of the Middle East. What has become of it? A country that does not even have sovereignty over its own territories. A country in which a parallel force prevails, the Hezbollah, which has taken the country hostage. And ladies and gentlemen, if we really want to achieve something, what has been ensured in international law, the disarmament of the Hezbollah, must also be enforced. And if we want to enforce the disarmament of the Hezbollah, then we have to apply international law. And that has existed since 2006 through the UN Resolution 1701, which was unanimously adopted by China and Russia, but not implemented. And then we had the 7th of October, which is a terrible memory for everyone. And on the 8th of October, the Hezbollah began a terrible missile attack on Israel, where tens of thousands of Israelis in the north of the country were forced to relocate for about 1.5 to 2 years. No one is talking about it today. And we have to admit that the Hezbollah violence has led to violence in Israel, to resettlement. Ladies and gentlemen, in the end, it must be stated that Lebanon will become a sovereign state. President Aoun has called for the disarmament of the Hezbollah, the implementation of international rules, and that the state authority is exclusively taken over by state security agencies, the police and the military. We have to support him in this, and that is also the intention of the federal government, and we support them with all our might. But dear colleagues, to be honest, the Hezbollah is not a force of its own accord. The Hezbollah is an extended arm of Iran. And if we look at Tehran, it becomes clear that the Hezbollah and Lebanon are part of a geopolitical challenge. A geopolitical challenge where China and Russia support Iran, and Iran has built up a nuclear capability over decades, which does not recognize Israel's right to exist, not to this day. And to undermine this, it has built up nuclear capabilities, ballistic capabilities, and additional terrorist arms like the Hezbollah, Hamas, and Houthis. And that's what it's all about, that we understand that the disarmament of the Hezbollah also has to go hand in hand with stronger pressure on Iran, and that we have to do everything to make it clear that if we do not achieve the system change in Iran, the Iranian population will not be able to do it on its own. We have to do everything through negotiations, international pressure and sanctions, that the financial flows to the Hezbollah and the south of Lebanon, I hold this very clearly, must not be permanently occupied by Israel. But we also have an understanding for Israel's security interests. It is in a situation in which it can hardly help itself otherwise, mainly because the far-reaching UN has failed with its pink glasses on the whole line. It is in the German interest that the promises of the so-called international community finally follow. For this, however, a disarmament of the Hezbollah is indispensable. And this, in turn, can only be achieved by a massive strengthening of the Lebanese government and army, a not least military strengthening, so that it succeeds in opposing the Hezbollah. More than 1 million Syrians and 200,000 Palestinian refugees are coming to 4.5 million inhabitants. This is the highest quota of refugees per capita worldwide, and for this, Lebanon deserves great respect. And at the same time, the country is exhausted by economic, currency, banking crisis, by political mismanagement, by the explosion in the port of Beirut 6 years ago with its devastating consequences, and now by the fatal escalation between Hezbollah and Israel. Many people are desperately trying to be safe. It is clear that the Hezbollah is responsible for the escalation. It weakens the state and endangers civilians. It is also clear that the Israeli government is also responsible. The massive military reaction, especially repeated attacks on residential areas and civil infrastructure, costs innocent lives. It destroys livelihoods and destroys hopes. There must be no attacks on the territorial sovereignty of Lebanon and no annexation. The holiday break announced yesterday, however, only lasted a few hours. Shortly thereafter, Israel carried out military operations in southern Lebanon again. It is clear that it cannot succeed without political will and without significantly increased international pressure. This pressure, which is also part of it, can only arise if the realities are clearly stated. Lebanon is a sovereign state. The ongoing military presence of Israel, the destruction in the south of the country, the expulsion of more than 1 million people, as well as the shelling of civil infrastructure by Israel, are unlawful. The south of Lebanon is now cut off from the rest of the country. A return of the population to southern Lebanon should be prevented in order, as the Israeli defense minister says, to create a so-called buffer zone. Ladies and gentlemen, a buffer zone is not a technical term. It is an euphemism for expulsion and permanent occupation, and for questioning Lebanese statehood. This is highly dangerous. I spoke to the Lebanese defense minister the day before yesterday. He warned very explicitly against losing sight of the confessional balance of power in Lebanon. The massive social tensions in the country and the military actions of Israel in the country are exacerbating the real danger of a civil war. Or, to give a second example, with regard to Iran, when Donald Trump fabricates that he wants to extinguish an entire civilization, if not everyone does what he wants. Does the Chancellor of the Federal Republic ridicule this reprehensible rhetoric in a press conference? Ladies and gentlemen, the people in Iran are not a negligible collateral damage. You are concerned with everything right now. Why don't you demand that the release of political prisoners and the reproduction of the Internet, an end to mass executions, becomes an integral part of the current negotiations? Why don't you demand that? And the tragic truth is that you, the USA, continue to strengthen this cruel regime with exactly this ignorance. And that is really cynical.